Okay, so you know how everyone's always talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Yeah, it's like constantly in the news, right?
Right. But do you ever feel like what we see in the headlines is like just the tip of the iceberg?
Totally. It's
Yeah.
so much deeper than that. Like, you
Yeah.
can't just sum it up in a few sentences, you know?
Exactly. And that's why we're doing this deep dive today to really get into it.
Yeah.
We've got some really fascinating sources here, a bunch of different perspectives. We've
Mm.
got excerpts from this academic book called The Israel-Palestine Conflict: Core Issues and Perspectives. Now, it's pretty dense, but we'll break it down.
Right.
And then we've got articles and resources from Al Jazeera, Britannica History Hit, and the AMARC Foundation. So
Yeah, that's a lot.
it's a lot, right?
Yeah.
But the goal is to like weave it all together. So by the end of this, you'll be able to actually explain this conflict to someone.
Yeah, and like understand the nuances because it's not black and white at all.
Not at all. So to kind of set the stage,
Yeah.
can you give us the super simplified version? Like, what's this conflict actually about?
Okay, so basically, it boils down to a dispute over land,
Okay.
land that's historically known as Palestine.
Hmm.
Both Israelis and Palestinians claim this land as their own, and they both have really strong historical, religious, and cultural ties to it.
Wow. So, like, how far back are we talking historically when it comes to Israel's claim to the land?
Well, their claim goes back thousands of years, like to biblical times.
Oh, wow.
They point to the existence of ancient Jewish kingdoms in that region as evidence.
I see.
And this historical connection is really central to the concept of Zionism. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I think so, but like a little refresher wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, so Zionism is basically the movement for a Jewish homeland, and it started gaining a lot of momentum in the late 19th century.
Okay, why then specifically?
Well, there were a few factors, but a big one was the rising anti-Semitism in Europe at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, of course, the horrors of the Holocaust during World War II just like solidified that need for a safe and independent Jewish state.
Right, because they didn't have anywhere to go.
Ex-
So, I mean, obviously the creation of Israel had huge implications for the people who were already living there, the Palestinians.
Absolutely. Like, imagine you've been living somewhere for generations and suddenly this major political shift happens. A new state is established.
Right.
This is exactly what the Palestinians went through in 1948. It's what they call the Nakba, which means catastrophe.
And like, how did that play out?
Well, it was a really traumatic event for Palestinians. It led to a massive forced displacement.
Like, how many people are we talking?
Over 700,000 Palestinians either fled or were expelled from their homes.
Wow, that's
And you know those stories from the AMARC Foundation?
oh yeah.
Like reading those personal accounts of what people went through, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, you really get a sense of the human cost of this conflict.
Absolutely. And this experience is at the core of the Palestinian narrative. It's why they demand an independent state of their own.
Right.
Specifically in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, these are the territories that Israel occupied during the 1967 war.
Okay, so these occupied territories have been a major flashpoint for decades, haven't they?
Right, and that's where things get really complicated because both sides have valid arguments.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Palestinian side first. Like,
Yeah.
what are their main concerns when it comes to these territories?
Well, they face a lot of challenges on a daily basis, things like limited access to resources, movement restrictions, and just this constant tension and uncertainty.
And one of the biggest issues is those Israeli settlements.
Exactly. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank is a huge point of contention. Palestinians see it as a violation of international law.
Yeah, and something that makes a future Palestinian state less and less likely.
Right, because it's like taking away land that they would consider theirs.
Right, but I mean, Israel defends those settlements.
Yes,
Like,
they do. Their main arguments are based on security and historical claims.
okay, so on the security front, they're saying.
They argue that the settlements help protect their borders from hostile neighbors and groups like Hamas.
I see. And historically.
Well, they cite biblical ties to the land as justification for their presence there.
So basically, it's like two completely different narratives clashing.
Exactly, and that's why finding common ground is so incredibly difficult because both sides feel like they're in the right.
Right, and with all this history and these entrenched positions, it's like, how do you even begin to solve something like this?
Yeah, it's a massive puzzle, and even when it seems like there's a potential solution, things fall apart.
Like, what about that two-state solution we always hear about?
Yeah, that's been the go-to idea for a long time. The idea of creating an independent Israel alongside an independent Palestine.
Sounds logical in theory.
It does, but in reality, it's so much harder than that.
Like, what are the main roadblocks?
Well, first of all, there are huge disagreements over borders, like where would the line be drawn?
Right.
And then there's Jerusalem, which is claimed as a capital by both sides. So that's a major sticking point.
And I imagine the issue of Palestinian refugees and whether they have a right to return is also pretty sensitive.
Incredibly sensitive. It's one of the most difficult aspects of the whole conflict.
So even when there have been attempts at peace, they haven't really gotten very far.
Right, and there have been some significant attempts like the Oslo Accords back in the 90s.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about those.
They were a big deal because they led to mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Okay, so that sounds like progress.
It was, but unfortunately, the hope that came with those accords kind of fizzled out.
Why?
Because a lot of the key issues like settlements, Jerusalem, and refugees remain unresolved, and the violence continued.
And we see that continuing even today with things like the Gaza blockade.
Right. The Gaza blockade is a perfect example of how this conflict impacts everyday lives. It's created this humanitarian crisis that's really hard to ignore.
Yeah, can you talk a bit more about the blockade and its effects?
Sure. So basically, it's this ongoing restriction of goods, people, and aid into and out of Gaza. And it's had devastating consequences for the Palestinians living there. It's created this feeling of isolation and despair and really difficult living conditions.
It's just tragic, and it's a reminder that this conflict is about real people and real lives.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important things to remember when we're discussing something as complex as this.
Right, like it's easy to get caught up in the politics and the arguments, but there's so much human suffering involved.
Yeah. And it's on both sides.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up, I think it'd be good to touch on some of those key historical events that have really shaped this conflict.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Like the 1967 Six-Day War that you mentioned earlier, that seems like a pretty major turning point.
It was a huge turning point in just 6 days. Israel captured the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights.
Wow.
It really solidified their control over these territories that are also claimed by Palestinians.
And then, of course, there was the 1948 war that led to the creation of Israel and the displacement of so many Palestinians.
Right, that war and its aftermath really set the stage for the conflict as we know it today.
And even the Oslo Accords, which seemed like a step towards peace, ultimately didn't lead to a lasting solution.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even when both sides come to the table, there are just so many obstacles to overcome.
And the fact that the violence continues in different forms, whether it's through clashes or the blockade, just shows how deep these divisions run.
Yeah, it's a really challenging situation.
Well, I think this deep dive has been incredibly informative, even for someone like me, who thought they had a pretty good understanding of the conflict.
It's a lot to take in, but I think it's so important to try to understand the nuances of this issue.
Right, and to avoid those oversimplifications that we often see in the media.
Exactly.
So as we wrap things up, what's like a final thought that you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the big question we should all be asking ourselves is, given all this history, all this complexity, what does a realistic path towards peace even look like?
Wow, yeah, that's a big one.
Is it a two-state solution? Is it something else entirely? Like, how do we even begin to bridge these divides?
Those are definitely questions worth pondering, and I think it starts with understanding both sides of the story.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a real eye-opener.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep asking questions, and let's keep having these important conversations.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks everyone.